After a year of delay from its original launch date, the Halo Infinite campaign is out on PC and console, and we're seeing the first time ever that a Halo game is launching day and date on PC. You may be wondering, how does it hold up on PC? What improvements are there over the Xbox Series X version? What are optimized settings like? I will answer all those questions and more in this video, so let's get straight into it. As is customary with any PC game, one of the first things you notice is the menu itself. I think Halo Infinite has a pretty great PC menu interface in general. There are a lot of graphical options here, and it is navigable in an intelligent way via mouse and keyboard. Sure, it could be less nested, but I have seen much worse. But perhaps you are like me and you have just loaded up the multiplayer beta and you might have noticed that something was not right performance-wise even in the menu itself. See, Halo Infinite renders a real 3D background in its menu where your graphical options affect the presentation of that real 3D background. It's a smart way for people to get a quick understanding of what the graphical options do. But I noticed immediately because of this that there's a flaw in how Halo Infinite by default presents its performance to the user. On loading up the game the first time, I noticed rather immediately that there was a periodic stutter in the frame rate. This appears to be a bug tied to the game's FPS limiter. The FPS limiter forces itself on when you use the game's VSync, or if you're not using VSync, it can be manually selected to any value you really wish. The FPS limiter seems to have a rounding error, if I were to guess, where instead of rounding to say 59.94, which is the frame rate value of a lot of 60Hz screens, it seems to round to 59.87 over a 10-minute period that I averaged. This doesn't sound like a big deal, but in practice it means that the VSync window is overshot periodically. On average, this means one frame time stutter every 15 seconds on a 60Hz VSynced screen. The higher the frame rate target is, the worse this behavior becomes. For a 120Hz screen, the average frame rate over 10 minutes was 119.77, which means a frame drop roughly every 4 seconds on average. If you look at that 120Hz footage, you can also see how those frame time stutters can have long intervals. Some at 16.6 milliseconds, but a number also going to 25 milliseconds and 33.3 milliseconds. This means that the frame time stutter caused by the FPS limiter will also have issues on G-Sync or FreeSync displays. To show that off, here's the game without VSync on, but using the in-game limiter set to 120. Notice how there are periodic dips in the frame time graph where the frame time goes above 8.3 milliseconds, sometimes to around 20 or 30 milliseconds. Those type of quick frame time increases look like stutters even on a G-Sync or FreeSync display. An external limiter like that from RTSS is also not perfect, but it is definitely much better than the internal frame rate limiter. Now the way to fix this, of course, is to not use that frame rate limiter, like you can see in this three-way comparison here on the far right-hand side, where external VSync does not suffer from these issues and the limiter is off. The problem is, for my optimized settings in this game, I want you in the audience to consider using dynamic resolution. For example, here, using an approximate of the Xbox Series X settings, the RTX 2070 Super at 4K native is not hitting 60 FPS on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, Dynamic Res, or DRS as it is called for short, is enabled, and 60 FPS is being achieved rather well. To enable DRS, you need to adjust the minimum frame rate value. 60 FPS for a 60Hz screen, for example, or 120 for a 120Hz screen, and so on and so forth. So what do I have a problem with exactly? Well, I found that the DRS really only works well on a VSync display if you're using the in-game VSync. Here's the game with the minimum FPS set to 60, Xbox Series X settings on an RTX 2070 Super at 4K. On the left with external VSync, in the middle with the internal VSync, and on the right, minimum frame rate is set to off as a control. Both the left and the middle are running at 60 FPS. But the middle, of course, with the in-game VSync, has a periodic frame time stutter that I described earlier. Now, this seems like everything should be good for using external VSync, considering it's running at 60 FPS here. But if you zoom in, you can see that the external VSync breaks the dynamic res. Instead of adjusting to a median resolution, which is just enough to hit 60 FPS, it drops automatically and without change to the lowest bound dynamic resolution possible. So that means that the middle image using internal VSync is much clearer than the one on the left using external VSync, as the resolution using internal VSync is adjusted properly. This can be confirmed rather easily by looking at the GPU utilization in both scenarios. The GPU is underutilized using external VSync, since the internal resolution is rendering much lower than it really should. So to effectively use dynamic res, which I would love to recommend as I find it an extremely effective tool in this game to get minimal quality loss at moments while keeping the frame rate up, well, you need to use the internal VSync, and the internal VSync induces stuttering. I don't find that a very great situation. Thankfully though, the other settings in the game all seem to work like they're supposed to and offer nice performance and visual scaling should you want to make optimized settings like I'm going to do in this video. As usual with the PC versions of games, the settings in Halo Infinite PC allow the game to scale graphically beyond the Xbox Series X version in a number of areas, though the type of scaling is limited. For example, the general lighting model is the exact same on PC, so it will have all the quirks found in the Xbox version that John detailed in his video. Ray tracing support will be coming from AMD in the future at some unknown point. Bizarrely, the PC version also has the animations for character faces and cutscenes being 30 FPS like the Xbox version. This is unexpected on PC, and I can only assume it is a bug at this point that is affecting all versions of the game. And surprisingly, the PC version actually manages to be technically lacking compared to the Xbox version in one key area, and that is variable rate shading. On the Series X, as John's video shows off rather well, variable rate shading tier 2 is used to selectively degrade surface quality to improve performance. This is not found in the options as far as I can tell, and I find this a shame as PC GPUs are definitely capable of this technology, and it could be a nice option to balance resolution and performance. Since this option is not on PC, there's no way I can do a direct comparison to Xbox GPU performance in this video. Maybe no VRS is a blessing in disguise though, as there's one curious advantage I found in the PC version. As John noted in his Series X video, multiple objects in the game world, as well as player weapons and hands, have a jiggly, swirly appearance in the open world, perhaps due to a precision issue. On PC, this is much lessened in direct side-by-sides in the same areas of the game world, curiously. I'm not sure why this is, but maybe VRS being on Xbox has some knock-on effects with this precision issue. But that's enough about the feature set here, and let's move on to those Xbox and optimized settings, going through the GPU performance of the settings from the heaviest to the lightest. And for optimized settings, I used an RTX 2060 Super, measuring the performance at 1440p, but the video capture on screen will be 4K of those same areas on a much beefier GPU, just so that I can show off the differences in a better manner. So unsurprisingly, one of the heaviest settings in Halo Infinite is in cloud quality, like many other games. This adjusts the resolution and realism of the volumetric clouds, with ultra to high increasing performance by 6%, ultra medium by 7%, and ultra to low by 11%. Here finding the Xbox settings required loading up the Tremonius mission, where its static time of day showcases the high setting, causing visual artifacting and flickering that is not on the ultra setting when moving the camera up and down. Series X in that area has that same visual flicker on that same up and down camera movement, indicating that it is using high settings, which makes sense I think given how much performance it saves. Here I recommend the high setting for optimized settings. One of the next significant settings is geometry quality. The setting adjusts the range at which LOD changes and modifies the amount of objects visible in the distance, like these trees here seen further away from the camera. Ultra has quite a few more than all the other settings. Here going from ultra to high can increase performance by 4% in a view like this, with medium being scarcely different, and low being 10% faster than ultra. Here the Xbox Series X uses the high setting, as can be seen by the amount of trees in the distance, but not medium, as that reduces the quality of some of the rock LOD in a way that is not present on Xbox. Even though I'm a big fan of that ultra look, as it makes the game view more stable when moving around. The performance win cannot be denied, and optimized settings means high here. After this comes shadows, where the shadow setting from ultra to high mainly reduces the resolution of shadow cascades at a distance, but in an honestly minor fashion. For example, this shadow from the structure here is a bit more complete on ultra. Medium to low then reduces the shadow cascade range for certain objects and resolution overall. Still, going from ultra to high increases performance by 6%, and medium's not much different. Low offers 8% better performance than ultra. Here, Xbox Series X uses the high setting, as can be seen in the incompleteness of the shadow, similar to that found on the high setting on PC. Here I recommend the high setting due to its minimal visual quality loss but sizable performance improvement. Though, I will note here that I find it a shame that the ultra setting is not so ultra in the end, as even on ultra the cascade range for shadows, especially for moving objects, can be pretty low. Enemies at the mid distance almost look shadowless at times or floating above the terrain. After this, there's the ambient occlusion setting, where going from ultra to low gradually decreases the size of the screen space ambient occlusion, offering a minimal 2% performance increase when going from ultra to high, and insignificant differences after that. Here the Xbox Series X appears to use the high setting based upon the exact shape and intensity of the ambient occlusion in this view, so I recommend high here. After this, the reflection setting controls screen space reflection quality, reducing resolution and physical correctness as the setting is turned down. Ultra to high sees very minor visual differences, in most cases for a 1.5% performance uplift. Medium is scarcely different, and low cuts off resolution intensely and removes some of the reflections for a 3% performance increase. Here, finding Series X settings was not easy until I realized that the resolve of SSR changes when horizontal res scaling happens when using DRS. So when I used a lower end GPU with DRS on, I could see the horizontal scaling would cause in this section the reflection of the lights to be blurred out at ultra, but as separate 3 dots on high here. And yep, Series X has 3 separate dots in the reflection here, indicating it being high. Here I find the minimal performance increase of using high worth it for optimized settings. Moving on, we have the lighting setting next, and this reduces the range at which artificial lights render into the distance. With ultra, for example, in this hallway, showing all the lights on in the hallway. High calls out the white light at the end of the hallway, medium calls out more, and low does even more. Here I measured a meager 1% performance difference in this instance going down to high, and curiously not much of a difference when going lower. Here I presume this can have a greater impact in scenes with more overlapping lights. Here the high setting isn't so intrusive, and I definitely recommend that, which also happens to be the exact same setting Xbox Series X is using, based upon the amount of lights called in the hallway here. The ground setting controls the density of foliage and the render distance and density of scattered objects like twigs, pebbles, and smaller boulders. Here the performance differed, measured was barely 2% between ultra and low, and here the Xbox Series X uses a setting closest to high, but there are some aspects when making this comparison that did not align with the setting below or even above. Here I recommend the high setting for optimized settings. The terrain setting controls aspects of the ground, but specifically the terrain displacement, with ultra adding a lot of undulations with tessellation that slowly erode to nothing when you go down the low. On the RTX 2060 Super, I measured almost no performance difference between them, perhaps because NVIDIA GPUs are really good at tessellation historically. Based upon the undulations in the terrain, I was able to deduce that Series X uses the high setting, where you can see this bit of terrain, for example here, being much bumpier on ultra and flatter like high on Xbox Series X. Here I recommend the Ultra setting for optimized settings on a modern GPU. The texture setting is a curious one. In general, I noticed that it reduced the range of textures at a distance when you would zoom in. Specifically here, with the battle rifle, when I zoom in, you can see the vegetation and rock textures degrade visibly as the setting goes down. I did not measure any performance difference at 1440p on the 2060 Super, which has 8 gigs of VRAM. Xbox Series X does not have the texture degradation when zoomed here with the BR in the scene, meaning it is most similar to the Ultra setting. My recommendation is that 8GB GPUs use Ultra at nearly every reasonable resolution, but GPUs with less VRAM can take care to adjust this setting downward. Then there's the depth of field setting. Depth of field is only found in cutscenes in this game, and reducing this changes the size of the bokeh shape or how out of focus an area can be, which makes the depth of field faster. In this instance, the large shape on screen is nearly 18% faster at medium than at high, and low runs is exactly the same as medium. Xbox Series X uses the high setting based on the bokeh size here, but as you can see, the bokeh shape is squished due to the horizontal resolution scaling from dynamic res that Xbox has. Here I recommend medium for those that want cutscenes to have a more consistent performance regardless of what is happening on screen. Other GPU settings are less important. Effects, for example. This reduces the quality of explosions and particle counts, but I had a hard time discerning what exactly was different between medium and ultra at all, and only low looked obviously different. As a result, I could not judge what Xbox uses. And as I see it, just use Ultra unless you're on an ancient GPU. Then there's the volumetric fog setting, which I expected to have better returns as this controls the resolution of volumetric lighting, making it look blockier and more aliased as the setting goes down. Here I found very minimal performance gains, and I already find the high setting to be a bit borderline in terms of quality. As a result, I recommend the highest setting in game, which is high, which is also what the Xbox Series X happens to use. Lastly, there's the anisotropic filtering setting, which I always recommend setting to the highest on PC, and Xbox Series X seems to use the high setting below Ultra when you look up close. The last important GPU setting is asynchronous compute. On the RTX 2060 Super, I saw a healthy uptick of 6% performance, for example, in this scene while having it enabled. So it goes without saying that optimized settings should have this on. Do note though that async compute will have varying performance impact per scene, and some architectures such as Nvidia's Pascal or earlier will see less utility from this setting than AMD's GCN and later, or Nvidia's Turing and later. All in all, the GPU related optimized settings look like this. A lot of settings on high, and those that are not important for performance are set to ultra. Depth of field is turned down to medium, and I want you to check out the game's dynamic res setting if you can, and under the presumption that they eventually fix this game's frame rate limiter. Unsurprisingly, these settings are not too far away from the Xbox Series X ones that I found. The gains though from optimized settings can be a bit minor. For example, in this scene, without DRS, the 2060 Super at 1440p on Ultra is 49 FPS and 55 FPS with optimized settings, a total 12% performance uptick. That's not very dramatic, and I think your best scaler for performance in this game is going to actually be resolution, which is why I want to stress using dynamic resolution, which the Xbox version definitely uses quite a lot. With these optimized settings in place for the GPU, the next thing you have to worry about is the CPU and its performance, and here's where things get rather rough in Halo Infinite. Based on my testing using the optimized settings at 720p, you need a rather beefy CPU to get stellar performance in Halo Infinite's open world when traversing through it. As this footage shows, a Ryzen 5 3600 is having some big frame time issues when driving around through the world, with many being above 16.6 milliseconds, something that the Core i9-10900K has much less of, but even then there are a number of incidents where that CPU would also see stutter drops below 60 FPS momentarily due to the CPU. So getting a perfect 120 FPS, for example, in the open world in this game would require something better than a 10900K, so set your expectations accordingly for this game. There are other settings in the game which purport to affect CPU performance, such as animation simulation or world simulation, but when changing them while CPU bound on the 3600, I saw no large change in frame rate, even with animated enemies at a distance. So your best bet for clawing back CPU performance will be geometry quality and shadows. GPU-wise, Halo Infinite comes across as a surprisingly heavy game on PC in my opinion, based on the visual output on screen at moments. Using my optimized settings on mid-range GPUs that I look at these days, it's interesting to see how an RTX 2060 Super and RX 5700 at 1440p in some situations and views have very similar performance. Yet when getting into combat, we can start to see a divide in Halo Infinite that reproduces itself across all GPU levels. AMD GPUs here hold their frame rate much more tightly with less severe drops in more intense moments. Though as I say this, I did notice that there were more one-time frame spikes found on AMD GPUs not found on Nvidia GPUs. The general divide though is really easy to see when driving through the world, like here,
where the 5700 can be nearly 17% faster than the 2060 Super,
a metric that is well outside the norm we see in other titles. Going up to the high-end at 4K, there is a very similar situation where some scenes are neck and neck at these optimized settings between the RX 6800 XT and RTX 3080. But a number of views and scenes in the game world show the AMD card commanding a 7% or 15% lead, or even when driving around, it can be up to 20% or higher, which is once again rather outside the standardized norm we see in rasterization titles. So both 343 and Nvidia really need to get to work here, as I see it, to shore up performance there on Nvidia GPUs, as it's not too pretty at the moment, even at 1440p here between these GPUs. Just to comment on performance in general, my optimized settings are very close to the Xbox Series X quality mode settings as I've shown in this video, and that makes me think there are still some rough spots in this PC version. For example, there are some weird performance drops at times out of nowhere, such as here in this cutscene where nothing is visibly changing on screen, yet you can see both GPUs have massive performance issues all of a sudden that then clear up even though not much has changed. There's also some weirdness I found on the RX 5700 once where reloading the level caused a massive performance dip, making me have to quit the game to start my performance recording again. And then there are other visual bugs that I found, including an occasional screen flash in the menus that I'm not going to show in this video for health reasons. Similarly, I cannot help but get the feeling that PC GPU performance is still not in a great place vis-a-vis what is happening on the Series X, especially on the Nvidia side of things, where an RTX 2060 Super at my optimized settings is really only going to have stable 60 FPS performance close to 1080p. As a reminder, my optimized settings are not too different from Xbox quality mode settings. So essentially I have a list of things I would love to see in this game. The first would be a fix for the animation issue John mentioned in his video. Then I would like to see an option for variable rate shading on PC with multiple levels of control for how much it degrades the image. Then I would love a fix for the frame time issue that I mentioned earlier in this video. And lastly, I would love to see some form of reconstruction technology like DLSS or XeSS in this game, as that tech is a strength of the PC platform and I would love to see it take advantage of here. But that's all stuff for the future. In the moment, at launch, I think Halo Infinite could be in a better place. It sure is playable, and I had good fun playing it. It can also look better than what we see on console, but it could use some work. I, for example, will not be playing to beat the campaign to completion until a number of the issues I mentioned are sorted out, as I really want to have a super smooth Halo experience that the current game does not always offer. But given 343's track record in the recent past, I imagine patches will remedy this all soon enough. But that's enough from me for now. If you did enjoy this video and found my optimized settings, for example, useful, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as DF posts a video. If you want to help us out and enable more PC vids like this in the future, support DF on Patreon. If you want to talk to me about this game on PC, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.